I love that lesson from my dad too, is you're going to go through hard times and it can break you. Or you can choose to be happy. You can choose to learn from that and move on.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Sparks of Gratitude podcast. I'm your host, Randy Sparks, and I believe that gratitude doesn't just change lives, but it can also save them. And today we have a guest returning to the podcast, our good friend, Mr. Chester Elton. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, Randy, thanks for the invite. Always fun to spend time with you.
Well, I'm so excited. I was so grateful the first time we spoke, more than a year ago, I think. We were introduced by Charles Bennett, one of our mutual friends. And when I met him, he says, "You have to meet my friend Chester Elton." I did, and I've been happy about that ever since. But a few days ago, you and I met again at a conference that our friend Derek Miner hosted called Build Then Bless Conference. And you opened the whole conference, and I was so happy to hear it.
Yeah, those guys, Derek and Greg Trimble and all those guys are just really, they epitomize really a life of gratitude. They're just good to the bone. So yeah, and to see you there, bonus, right?
Yep, I think so. So something that I pointed out and we talked about, which I thought would be a great theme for today's conversation, is what I noticed is some of the most powerful moments that you and I have spoken about, or that I hear you speak about, is when you talk about lessons that you've learned from your father, and you always tell stories about him. And I thought there's a whole episode in that, just to hear you talk about your father, what you learned from him, lessons from him, and how this mission of gratitude may have come from that. So when you think of your father, what comes to mind first?
Well, just a happy guy. My dad was just a happy guy. He was one of those just personalities where you couldn't have a bad day around him. He just made you feel better about yourself. And it's interesting because, Randy, a lot of times you think, oh, what a lucky guy, good genes, or, how fortunate for him. And it wasn't that. It really was by design. He worked at it. And it's so interesting. So, years later, here I am, he's long gone. I take a look at that and I think, you know what? He did a couple of things very intentionally to design a life of gratitude. And I thought I've been thinking about our conversation, how I could put this in a way that your listeners could say, okay, interesting guy, fun guy. How do I emulate that? And the first thing that he did is he noticed. He looked for the good in people. He really did. We have a philosophy in our work, assume positive intent, which I know you live by. You assume that people are trying hard. They're going to make mistakes, and very few people set out to offend you. They may inadvertently, right? But it's rare that that's their intention, right? So he would look for the good in people and he would notice it. The other thing is he would then vocalize it. He would call it out. And you're right. I have a million stories about my dad. The one I love to tell is my mom and dad grew up in the area where you dressed for work. Like when my dad went to work, it was the nice suit and the silk pocket square and the beautiful tie and, the hat and the glasses. And my mother was very much into fashion. In fact, she was a fashion model and had a modeling school. And so she always, when my parents entered the room, it was an event, it was like the windows at Macy's, at Christmas time. So I'll never forget, I'm in church with my dad and we're sitting in the pew. And my mom walks into the chapel. And again, this is vocalizing. You notice and then vocalize. He nudges me and he says, "Chess, look at your mom. Isn't she beautiful? Isn't she talented? Aren't we lucky?" And I never forgot that. I thought, this is a guy. My parents were married for 65 years. My dad was completely smitten and madly in love with my mom for 65 years. And that moment to me said it all. Because it wasn't just, isn't she beautiful? It's, isn't she talented? My mother was a wonderful pianist and would accompany my dad when he would sing. And then the added bonus, aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky to have Irene Elton in our lives? And I just thought, that's a guy that worked at it, you know? The third thing is he'd choose his response. But I'm curious. So you hear that story, you're smiling. What's going through your head?
Well, I'm thinking, so I'm internalizing this and then reflecting it back and imagining my parents, my grandparents as you're telling this story. Because I'm imagining my grandfather was always dressed with his French cuffs and his links and a
Nice.
pocket square, and that's how I remember him. And the older he got, the more positive and wonderful he got. But then in my later life, I started to notice. I know we're here to talk about your experiences and what you learned from your parents and so on, but this is bringing me back to specifically right now my grandfather, who so much of him is reflected in my father too. But I have people come up to me in the last 40 years of my life. I turned 50 this year, but I remember, and since he's passed away, I have random people come up to me and they hear my last name and they say, Sparks, I remember your grandfather when I was in college and he paid for my school.
Oh, why
He
not?
paid for this. And just all these things that he did behind the scenes to just show support and love for people that no one would ever know. And he just did it because he cared. And he always smiled and laughed, and he would come pick me up on Saturday mornings, and just I always knew that he cared about me. And
Yeah, see, he vocalized it, right? He
yeah,
would tell you over and over again, how much he loved you and how important you were, and that's so important. My dad also had this saying, he said, "You have to choose to be offended." Isn't that interesting? Like,
interesting.
he'd say, "Happiness is a choice, choose to be happy." If you've if you've got a choice between being miserable and being happy, choose happy, it's better. He had a lot of, fun sayings, and it's funny because as he got older and we'd attribute these sayings to him, he was very much in the Yogi Berra, moment as he got older. He'd say, "I don't think I said half the things I said." But we'd hear someone say, "Well, that sounds like dad," so then we'd attribute it to dad. This idea though that you have to choose to be offended. My brother told me this story, and it just is so dad. After church, and in my faith, in your faith, our ministry is volunteer, right? Like they ask you to run the nursery or teach Sunday school or whatever, and you do it for a couple of years, whatever, and then you'd go on to do something else. Well, at the time, he was like the young men's minister, and after church, this older woman in our congregation, everybody's got one, just the miserable old lady, and wants everybody to share in her misery, right? Comes up to my dad and says, Brother Elton, you think all the young people in our congregation just love you. Well, I'm here to tell you, they don't. Just as mean, right? So my dad looks at her with this big smile, says, well, thank you very much. And she says, it wasn't a compliment. And he looks at her and he says, too late. And I thought, that's the perfect response, right? It's kind of like, and he would joke with me later. He says, Jess, I'm at a certain point in life where no matter what people say to me, I take it as a compliment. you know, and this idea of choose your response. You can choose to be offended, or you can choose to say, look, she's an unhappy person, and I'm not going to go there. And I'm sure he was hoping to make her smile and laugh. He didn't, unfortunately. The thing is, though, is he chose not to be offended, and I love that. That's just such a better way to live.
That is so funny but so enlightening. So my question is, how much do you know about how he became that way, where he decided to choose that?
Yeah, what's interesting, and I have the same experience you do with your grandpa and so on. People come and say, "Oh, I knew your dad, and he's just the most delightful guy." His life wasn't without hardship. In fact, severe. My parents had 7 children, 5 survived. So I had an older sister that I never knew. I'm the youngest of the 5 surviving boys, who was involved in a terrible accident when she was 5 and passed away. I mean, you can imagine a 5-year-old little girl, and the only girl that my parents had, Dixie Ann. My My grandma Elton was from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so as a tribute to his mom, they named her Dixie, Terrible tragedy. He talked about that for a year, he had a pain in his heart that never went away. He would visit her grave every Sunday and talk to her. I remember as my dad was getting older, my brother Byron went to talk to Dad, and he said, just off the cuff, he goes, "Dad, do you ever think about Dixie? Dixie Ann?" And he says, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, I'm just wondering. I mean, do you ever think of Dixie?" He goes, "Every day. I think about her every day." So, and that's a lesson as well. And then I had a younger brother that, it was a doctor's mistake. It was a doctor's mistake in both their deaths, actually. My sister, when she went into the hospital, they kept her overnight. They thought she was going to be okay. They didn't catch that she had internal bleeding and she bled out. She didn't have to die. Shouldn't have. And my younger brother, my mom has this rare blood, Rh negative, and you have to do a certain thing or the mother's immune system actually attacks the immune system of the baby, and the doctor missed it. I remember going to his funeral. I was like 4 or 5 years old. And we thinking, what's wrong with that baby? It looks fine to me. So again, tremendous heartache, and yet chose to say, yeah, but so what are my options? I could wallow in that sorrow, be easy. No one would blame him. Or we can build on 5 beautiful boys. Let's move forward. So, I love that lesson from my dad too, is you're going to go through hard times and it can break you, or you can choose to be happy. You can choose to learn from that and move on.
That's really powerful. I have a theme that rolls through every conversation that I have on this podcast, Chester, that it's the gratitude through the hard things that really makes it count. And it's, why is this happening? Or how is this happening for me? Not why is this happening to me? And people that are able to make that shift in the conversation. And it sounds like you saw that with your parents, that they chose.
Yeah. And Dad was always at the center of that. He really was. He'd say, hey, we can laugh or we can cry. Laughing's better. and he laughed a lot.
Okay, so I had someone on the podcast, one of my first guests. His name was Bob Goff, and he's amazing. He's one of the people that, of all people I've ever met in life, he's the one that lives the most all in. He's just spectacular human. And he said something to me when I asked about, a pivot point in his life, an important pivot point. And he says, well, one of my biggest pivot points was when I learned that I'm not my father. And I was curious about that. He says, well, because he says, I think we're all in some ways a reaction to or a reflection of our father or our parent, right? And both are beautiful. And so what do you think of that? In what ways are you a reaction to or a reflection of your dad?
Yeah, I love that I'm a reflection of my dad. I don't want to be like my dad. I go, oh, that's too bad. You didn't have my dad, or you definitely want to be him. I do think that, we talk about who are the people that had the biggest impact on you, for good or ill. And there's no question that your parents, if you know them, I know there are circumstances where, kids don't know their parents. They adopted or abandoned or whatever. And so, it's for the good and for the bad. But yeah, no, my dad looms large in all our lives. One of the things that I've come to learn is that I have 4 older brothers that I adore and that adore me. And I have 4 sister-in-laws that I adore and adore my wife. And I find that's actually fairly unusual. You grow up, you think everybody loves everybody. And, I remember the first time when I was in middle school or something, and I went over to one of my friend's house and his parents were arguing, like yelling at each other. And I didn't know you could do that. I never saw that. I never saw my father ever raise his voice to my mother, other than like, look out or duck, and so I just thought everybody's parents loved each other, So at my father's funeral, we gathered the 5 boys. And one of the questions was, what's the greatest lesson dad taught you? And, we went around. It was like, oh, to be a good storyteller or to look at the brighter side of life or whatever. My brother, Kim, the middle brother, he said, I think the greatest lesson dad taught us was how to love your wife. And we all kind of looked at him and went, yeah, okay, you win. When you have 5 boys, it's always a competition, no matter what it is, right? And I've reflected on that, and he did. He always held the door for my mom. He always was so complimentary. He never raised his voice. And my relationships can be difficult, and I'm sure they had difficult times. Never took offense. He never, for a minute, I've had this conversation with my lovely wife, Heidi. We'll be married 43 years this year. My parents for 65. So set a goal, 65 is sort of the minimum, right? I'll tell her, I said, I grew up learning that one of my jobs as your husband is to never have you doubt for a second how much I love you and how important you are to our family. And she goes, yeah, I really appreciate that. I said, yeah, that's good. So that loving environment, I think, is another great lesson from just growing up in a happy household. I will tell you a cute story because being the youngest, and there's 5 years between my brother and I. So for 4 or 5 years, I had my parents all to myself, which was unique in the brothers, right? And being a teenager, and I forget I don't even remember what it was, but I got kind of snarky with my mom. And I said something in a little bit of a raised voice and a little unkind. And my dad was home. And I remember him coming out of the bedroom. We had this lovely house in West Van. You could enter and the front door, but you can enter in the back because it was on the side of a mountain, right? Beautiful views. Vancouver's spectacularly beautiful. Anyway, I was a little snarky with my mom, and I'm at the top of the stairs going to head down to my bedroom. And my dad comes out, and I went, oh, this isn't going to be good. And he puts his arm around me, and he says, Chess, you know how much I love you? I said, yeah. And he says, and you know how much I love your mom? I go, yeah. And he says, if I ever hear you speak to her like that again, I will knock out all your teeth and throw you head first down those stairs. Now, this is a different era. Like, you'd say, oh, well, that's abuse or anything. But, back in the, 70s, that was how you grew up, right? It could be violent. And I remember looking at him saying, yeah. And he said, so what you're going to do is you're going to go into the kitchen right now. You're going to apologize to your mom. Are we clear? I went, crystal clear, Dad. Let me go do that right now, And he did it in this sort of loving, terrifying way that there was no doubt. I had no doubt how much he loved me. I had no doubt how much he loved my mom. And I had no doubt that he would absolutely throw me head first down those stairs, And that was, putting things back in place. And, some of your listeners might think, wow, that's, horrifying. Yeah. You have to understand, though, after, I was probably 16 or 17 years old, 17 years with my dad, knowing how much he really did love us both, it was somehow appropriate. I don't know. It just makes sense to me that he would defend her like that and teach me at the same moment with the threat of, imminent danger present.
Yeah. What a great lesson. And one, I see a beautiful smile with a mouthful of teeth. So you may,
Yeah, it didn't happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that you could be reprimanded and at the same time feel the deep love and not question it is, I hear that in the story. Like that seems to come through really clear.
Yeah.
And he earned that by showing it because, like you said before, you learned that he would notice, and vocalize.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting. Like your grandpa, my parents were always of service. It's really interesting. We took in so many stray kids. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up and come to the breakfast table and there'd be some kid there that I distinctly remember. We had a breakfast that we called it mush. It's oatmeal. Red River cereal is what it is up in Canada, or Quaker Oats, whatever you'd have. And I remember coming up for my mush. We called it mush. It's like, so Oliver, may I have some more, please? And there's this young woman at the breakfast table, and I said, so I remember saying this So I know why I'm here because this is my house. Who are you and why are you here? You know, but and again, this legacy of service where there would be these kids that just needed a safe place. And that was our house. And sometimes they would stay with us for like a year. It wasn't unusual. And I never thought twice about it because, kids grow up and they leave and there'd be an extra bedroom. And then all of a sudden there'd be a kid in that bedroom. And my mom would work them. Like she would teach my mom, when it was time to clean, it was clean. I mean, it was, and I thought that was really interesting. She said, one of the greatest things we can teach these kids is how to work. Just teach them a good work ethic. That'll be good. That'll be good. And we'd have kids that would come back. They'd go off and it wouldn't quite, and they would come back. Now, what's really interesting is I was going over this. This was a while ago now with my wife. I said, how many kids have we had come live with us? It's like a dozen. And it's so funny. I never thought twice about it until I went back and thought, well, yeah, that's what you do. And I'll never forget, we had this one kid. It was really a tough situation. And I remember saying to him, I said, we have a spare room. If you want to come live with us, you can. Well, I want to organize it. I'm just saying, I'm not going to make you come. I'm just saying that we've got a room when you're ready. And I'll never forget getting the call and he'd say, Chess, Brother Elton, whatever it called me. Do you still have that room? I go, yeah. I said, when do you want to come over? Said, can I come over like now? Absolutely. Bring your stuff. And he stayed with us for well over a year. And he's on track. He's a great kid. I mean, he's a great kid. And I look at that and go, why would I do, why? And my wife just bought in immediately. Oh yeah, I know him. Yeah, but sure, bring him in. I thought, why is that not a big deal for us? Mom and Dad.
I'm just imagining the impact on the lives and the ripple that takes out by noticing and caring for the one.
Yeah, yeah. And it is. It's like that story about the kid with the starfish, there's the endless need, right? The guy says, well, you have no chance of saving all these starfish. Yeah, but it made a difference for that one, That starfish is glad I walked along. So I really do. And that's that whole thing around, you and I met at the Kindness Summit and the one kind act a day can change the world and build then bless. What are you doing to build people up and bless their lives, even if it's just a few dollars here or there? All those little things, they do make a difference. They absolutely do. And it is overwhelming. I mean, I think I joked on the presentation I made at the conference. I go, look, if you want to cheer yourself up, don't go into your news feed. That's not gonna, the ratio of bad news to good news there is like 1,000 to 1, At the same time, what are some of the things you can do? Yeah. And it is there you build that legacy of goodness and service and kindness. And it's just bit by bit. Just what did you notice today? Who did you tell? My dad was great about reaching out to people and saying, hey, I was just thinking about you. Just checking in. How you doing? He would call me up in the middle of the night because he never really figured out the 3-hour time change from Vancouver to New York, And, pre smartphones and whatnot, the phone would ring at 2:00 in the morning. Well, when you had landlines and your phone rang at 2:00, it wasn't usually good news. Somebody was stranded somewhere, right? I'll never forget, my dad would call me up and he'd say, hey, Chess, I heard this joke. I want to share it with you. Dad, it's 2 a.m. He goes, yeah, no, it's only 11:00 here. Okay. What's the joke? He'd make us memorize poems and sayings and stuff. That call that I'm remembering, he'd go, hey, I heard this thing. You should memorize this. I said, what is it, Dad? He says, yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. But today is a gift. That's why they call it the present. Get it? The present. I go, yeah, I got it. Say it back to me. I go, hey, one more time. I got it. Okay, love you. Click. I'd come back to bed and Heidi would say, what was that? I go, wrong number.
Well, you got your dad's sense of humor. There you go.
Yeah, wrong number. You were on the phone for 10 minutes ago. Yeah, it was Dad. I'll tell you later.
Oh my gosh, it's funny about that quote. That's one of my favorite quotes. I love it. This moment, all we have is this moment, right? And in fact, I had some folks over last night, and I shared that quote with them because I'm like, we can't stress about what's to come or regret or resent what came in the past. We have this moment, and everything we have and everything we need is in this moment because it is in fact all we have.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned about the impact of the small things in the one and making the difference with that one starfish and so on. And so those little moments that can have an impact on the one or can ripple and go bigger. So were there any stories or experiences with your dad where he said something that might have felt small at the time, but now you've just learned that that's began to blossom and grow?
Well, yeah, this is a story I often tell. I think I told it at the conference, and I often end my keynotes with the story of a homeless woman, that we came across. My dad, we had a wonderful tradition of Saturday morning tennis. And it's so funny because he was a radio announcer, quite talented, and then he went into management. And so he managed radio stations. And when I was a kid, we moved from Edmonton to Vancouver, which I always joke is a serious upgrade. I mean, Edmonton's a lovely city, super cold. It's really far north, Vancouver, this, tropical, beautiful, wonderland. Anyway, and it's British Columbia, Randy. So, very much influence of, Queen and country. Well, now king and country. But so we belonged as part of him managing CKWX radio. He got a membership to the Vancouver Lawn Tennis and Badminton Club. Oh, I mean, and it was all whites. And you'd go in the front door and, the guardian, his name was Basil. I mean, you can't make this up. It was something right out of, Downton Abbey kind of thing, Anyway, we had a tradition. We'd often play tennis Saturday mornings, and then we'd go to McDonald's and get a McMuffin. My dad loved a bargain, though. One of his favorite sayings was, if you've got to pay retail, you have not got enough friends, right? Who do we know in cars, in suits, and whatever we needed, So anyway, he loved to go to this place called the Army and Navy. The deep discount. You'd buy the surplus, whatever. 10 cents on the dollar. That was his thing. If you get it, 10 cents on the dollar. Anyway, but it was in a rough part of town called Gastown, and so we played tennis. Rough. I'm a teenager at this point, and we're walking by Pigeon Park where the homeless people would hang out, and sure enough, as we're getting ready, this older woman's coming across the street, big paper sack with everything she owned, and it split open and it spilled on the sidewalk. Now, if you've ever been to Vancouver, Vancouver's a walking city. I mean, there's people on the streets everywhere, which is lovely, right? But as soon as that happened, everybody just gave her a wide berth and kept moving. I mean, she became invisible to everybody but Dad. And he went over to her right away, and he knelt down and he gathered up her stuff and made her laugh. That was Dad. And he got her safely in the park. And I'm watching this, and he comes back. And of course, being a teenager and knowing everything there was to know at that point, I said, Dad, you probably shouldn't touch those people. They're not clean. And he had this big smile. He looked at me, and this is one of those moments, right? He said, you be good to everybody. Everybody's having a tough day. And I thought, you be good to everybody's having a tough day. For that woman, every day's a tough day, right? Another moment along that same line is I remember we were in traffic, and there was this guy driving this beautiful British car. It wasn't a Jaguar. It was what's the one up from that? It wasn't a Bentley, but it was a luxury car.
Austin Martin.
That's it. Yeah. James Bond, right? Austin Martin. And I remember looking over and I go, hey, Dad, look at that guy's car. He goes, oh, that's a nice car. I go, what would it be like to be that guy? And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, don't ever wish that. I said, what? He goes, you don't know what's going on in that guy's life. That car may be the only good thing in his life, And again, he said, you don't want to trade places with anybody. Everybody's got something. So 2 stories to just say, and it is true. If you assume that 90% of the people you bump into have got something really hard going on, you're going to be right. you know? Like my dad, the happiest guy you ever met. You go, "Yeah, he buried 2 children." Are you wanting that? Probably not. And yet, happiest guy you'll ever meet. So, yeah, this idea of that my dad was just kind to everyone. Yeah, that stuck with me.
Mm, those are great stories. You mentioned to me that your dad wanted to sing at his own funeral.
Yeah, and he did.
All right. So tell us how that worked.
This is the best adult Elton story of all time. Yeah. So my dad being a radio announcer, and he had this beautiful baritone voice, and we all sang in the choir and stuff, but there was no in the church choir, but there was no mystery as to who the star was. It was Dad, right? Anyway, as he got older, he and my mother loved to perform, and my mom was quite an accomplished pianist and a great accompanist. There's a talent to be able to accompany someone, to be able to move with the flow and the meters and so on. Anyway, and I grew up, my mom playing the piano in the morning and rehearsing, and whenever we had an event at our house, and this was back when you entertained, uh, people would demand that they sing. I mean, they were coming. It was going to be, there was going to be a show, and it was going to be Dalton Irene. Well, as he got older, and his friends would start to pass away, they would request he sing at their funeral. And one of the often requested songs was the old Negro spiritual "Going Home," and he would, and it was lovely and memorable, kind. Well, he decides, he goes, "Look, I'm going to sing at my funeral. I'm not going to ask somebody else to sing. Nobody's better than me," right? The guy, competitive guy. So he and my mom, as his voice started to kind of fade a little bit, rented a little studio and they recorded on a cassette tape, as you would back then, right? Anybody who remembers cassette tapes. And he gave it to my brother John and he said, "Look, at my funeral, play this. Now, don't listen to it, but near the end, pop it in and play it." And my brother, true to his promise, didn't listen to it. He pops it in. We'd told all these stories of Dad, and my mom was still alive at that point, and he pops it in, and my dad's voice comes on, and he says, "Well, if you're listening to this, it's pretty obvious. I've gone to the great beyond." And he says, "I think I know 2 things for sure. One is I don't think I died of natural causes. And the second is I think the killer's in the room." So here we are, we're like, "Oh, no." And then he said, "My friends often ask me to sing at their funerals. Well, I decided I want to sing at mine." So Ike, my Irene, he called her Ike, and she starts to play. And he sings "Going Home." And there's not a dry eye in the house. Anyway, he at the end, he hits a sour note because in choir, in the rehearsal, he would always hit a sour note. That never in a performance, that would never happen. Just to drive the choir director a little crazy. And we all knew it was coming, and we'd all join in, right? And then he said, and it was really interesting, he said, "Boys, sing no sad songs for me. I lived a great life. I married the love of my life. I have 5 great boys and countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So sing no sad songs for me." He says, "And I don't know which way I'm going, if it's up or it's down. But I do know this, whichever way it is, I'm sure I'll see a lot of you there." Yeah, the mic drop moment. And it was so interesting because that was Dad. Now, if you'd like, we got a few minutes here. I actually have that recording. Would you like to hear 30 seconds?
I'd love to hear that recording.
So this is Dalton Elton being accompanied by Irene Elton on the piano, singing at his funeral. Come on. Can you hear that?
Going home, going home. I'm just going home. Quiet like some still day. I'm just going home. It's not far, just close by, through an open door. Work all done, cares laid by, gonna grieve no more. Mother's there, expecting me. Father's waiting too. Lots of folk gathered there, all the friends I knew. All the friends I knew. Home, home. I'm going home.
Well, there you go. As you can imagine, everybody sitting there, and most people had heard him sing before and knew that voice and knew that goodness. And but isn't it fun? At the end of that, he'd say, "Sing no sad songs for me. I had a great life."
Chester, I'm so happy you shared that. It reminds me of my grandfather with a deep baritone voice, just like that, and his sister would accompany him. And every time the family got together, it was a show.
Yeah,
And
that was an event. Yeah,
that with your own father's story, I get to reflect on mine. So it means a lot to me.
well, I'm glad. You know, Randy, we're lucky to have those kind of people in our lives, and I think there are people like that in a lot of people's lives, and they just haven't thought about it that way. That there was an aunt or an uncle or a neighbor or a teacher or a coach, and you reflect back and you go, you know, I was lucky to have them in my life, you know, and I'm going to reach out to them and you know, vocalize it and say thank you. And you know, it's interesting. From time to time, somebody will come to mind, and I'll just give them a call and say, "Hey, I was thinking about you the other day. Do you remember when it was this and this and this? I just want to let you know that, you know, I love that we met. I love that we shared some time together, and you mean a lot to me." By the way, no one ever says, "Gee, I wish you hadn't called." You know, in that hierarchy of needs, you know, that area of being appreciated and being remembered. And I love that we have that recording. You know, that's Dad's voice, and I can remember as a little kid sitting there, you know, and he had this whole repertoire, and he'd make us memorize poems that his dad had shared with him, and even through really hard times, you can say, "You know what? Look at the whole picture, look at the whole painting. It's a masterpiece. Yeah, it's flawed. There's always flaws, but all in all, look at your mom. Isn't she beautiful? Isn't she talented? Aren't we lucky?"
And you really are. Chester, I don't know a better place to put a punctuation at the end of this conversation than that. Other than thank you. And also to thank you for your attention and for noticing. I mean, even in just the text message I sent you the other day, and this is your response. Thank you for reaching out. I was hoping you would. You made me feel like you cared about it. So thank you for that.
Oh,
Thank you for sharing about your father with us on the conversation today. So
yeah, it's an easy topic, and it's a happy topic. But yeah, no, really, I appreciate when we met, you said, "You know, I'd like to have you on my podcast, talk about your dad." I went, "Hey, I'll do that all day long." Yeah. How long is your podcast? Can we go for is 4 hours? Is that too long? You know, But no, it's always a pleasure, Randy. I love it when we reconnect. And so thank you for this. And hopefully somebody out there is listening saying, you know what, that was a little bit of my dad too, or my grandpa. And today I'm going to look for the good, and I'm going to tell people, and I'm going to choose not to be offended. I'm going to choose to be the one that lifts people up. And if we did that today, that was a good day.
There you go, everyone. There's your invitation for the day, and then the next one. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.